It used to be that money had weight. If you wanted to trade with another country, you didn't send numbers across a screen. You shipped gold. Real, physical metal. Heavy, limited, and universally understood. For centuries, that was the foundation of global trade. But today, the global economy runs on something very different. Right now, somewhere in the world, two countries are doing business with each other. They don't share a language, a border, or even a political system, but they're using the same currency, the US dollar. And here's the strange part. Most of those transactions have nothing to do with the United States. So why does the world rely on American money? How did one country's currency become the backbone of global trade, finance, and power? To understand that, you have to go back to a moment when the world was broken. At the end of World War II, much of Europe and Asia lay in ruins. Infrastructure was destroyed, economies had collapsed, entire financial systems had been wiped out. The old global order, centered around empires and the British pound, was gone. But one country emerged from the war stronger than ever: the United States. Its factories were intact, its economy was booming, and most importantly, it held the majority of the world's gold reserves. Something like 2/3 of all global gold was sitting in US vault. That gave the US something that no other country had: financial leverage. So in 1944, before the war had even ended, representatives from 44 countries met in a small town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. Their goal was to design a new global financial system, one that would prevent the chaos of the Great Depression from ever happening again. They needed stability, predictability, and a system that countries could trust. And the solution they came up with was simple, but incredibly powerful. The US dollar would be tied to gold, $35 for 1 ounce, fixed, stable, guaranteed. And every other currency would be tied to that dollar. This meant that if you trusted the dollar, you were effectively trusting gold. And if you trusted gold, you trusted the entire system. It turned the dollar into the center of the global economy. Countries began holding dollars in their reserves. International trade started becoming conducted in dollars. The dollar wasn't just another currency anymore. It was the currency, and for a while, it did work. Global trade expanded rapidly, economies recovered. The system created a kind of financial order that the world hadn't seen before. But there was a problem built into it from the very beginning. The system depended on trust. Specifically, trust that the United States actually had enough gold to back all the dollars it was issuing. And over time, that trust started to break down. In the 1960s, the United States began spending heavily. Massive government programs at home, expensive wars abroad, especially in Vietnam. Money was flowing out of the country at an increasing rate. At the same time, dollars were spreading across the global economy. Countries were accumulating them through trade, investments, and reserves. And eventually, foreign governments started noticing something. There were more dollars in circulation than there was gold to back them. So, they started asking for gold. If you're holding dollars that are supposed to be convertible into gold, and you begin to suspect that promise might not hold over, you convert them while you still can. And that's exactly what happened. Countries like France began demanding gold in exchange for their dollar reserves. US gold reserves started to shrink, and the system was under pressure. And then, in 1971, everything changed. President Richard Nixon went on television and made an announcement that would reshape the global economy. The United States would no longer convert dollars into gold. The gold standard was over. Just like that.
I directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
The dollar was no longer backed by anything tangible. No metal, no fixed assets, just trust. At that point, you might expect the dollar to collapse. After all, the entire system had been built on the idea that it was as good as gold. But that's not what happened. Instead, the dollar became even more powerful, because the United States replaced the gold standard with something else: oil. In the 1970s, the US reached a strategic agreement with Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter at the time. The deal was straightforward. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in US dollars, and in return, the United States would provide military protection and political support. Other oil-producing nations followed, and this created what's known as the petrodollar system. and it changed everything. Oil is the most important commodity in the global economy. Every country needs it for transportation, for their industries, for energy, everything. And now, if you wanted to buy oil, you needed dollars. Not your own currency, not gold, dollars. That created constant global demand for the US currency. It didn't matter if you were in Europe, Asia, Africa, or South America. If you needed oil, and every country does, you needed dollars. So countries began stockpiling them. Central banks held dollar reserves, corporations conducted international trade in dollars, financial institutions issued loans and debts in dollars. The system became self-reinforcing. The more the dollar was used, the more necessary it became. And that gave the United States an enormous advantage. Because when your currency is the one that the entire world relies on, you play by a different set of rules. For one, the US can borrow money more easily than almost any other country. If another country runs large deficits, investors might lose confidence. Its currency could weaken, borrowing costs could rise, a crisis could follow. But the US is different, because the world needs dollars. There's always demand for US government debt. It's seen as safe, stable, reliable, and that allows the US to run deficits at a scale that would be unsustainable for most other countries. There's also something economists call exorbitant privilege. It's the idea that the US can essentially pay for goods, services, and investments using its own currency, one that the rest of the world is willing to hold. In simple terms, the US can print money, and other countries accept it as payment. That is not normal. That's a unique position of power, and it goes beyond just borrowing. Because the global financial system runs on dollars, the United States has influence over how the system operates. International transactions often pass through US banks or dollar-based clearing systems. That gives the US government leverage. If it wants to impose sanctions on another country, it can restrict access to the dollar system. And when that happens, the effects can be severe. A country cut off from dollar-based finance can struggle to import goods, pay their debts, or conduct international trade. Its economy can be effectively isolated. That's why sanctions have become such a powerful tool of US foreign policy. But this system doesn't come without its costs, especially for the rest of the world. For many countries, reliance on the dollar creates vulnerability. If your economy depends on access to dollars, then decisions made in Washington can directly affect your financial stability. Interest rates set by the US Federal Reserves can influence borrowing costs around the world. If rates go up, capital can flow out of emerging markets and back into the US, causing currencies to weaken and economies to slow down. There's also the issue of debt. Many countries borrow in dollars, especially developing companies, but they earn revenue in their own currencies. If their currency loses value relative to the dollar, their debt becomes more expensive to repay. That can lead to financial crisis. We've seen it happen again and again. Countries trapped in cycles of borrowing, currency depreciation, and austerity. And all of it tied, in some way, to the dominance of the dollar. Given these challenges, it's really not surprising that some countries want alternatives. China, for example, has been pushing to increase the global use of its currency, the yuan. Russia and others have also explored systems that bypass the dollar entirely. There are even discussions about digital currencies and new financial infrastructures that could reduce reliance on traditional systems. But replacing the dollar is incredibly difficult, because its dominance isn't just about economics, it's about trust. Global markets trust US institutions, they trust its legal system, they trust its financial infrastructure. Even when there are political tensions or economic uncertainty, the dollar is still seen as a safe place to put money, and that kind of trust takes a long time to build. It's not something you can create overnight. There are also practical challenges. The euro, for example, is widely used, but it's tied to a group of countries with different fiscal policies and political priorities. The yuan is controlled by Chinese governments, which limits its flexibility in global adoption. Gold, while still valuable, isn't practical for modern digital transactions. So for now, there's no clear alternative that offers the same combination of stability, scale, and global acceptance. Which means the dollar remains at the center of the system, but that doesn't mean it always will. History shows that reserve currencies change over time. The British pound once held the same position that the dollar does today, and eventually it lost it. The same could happen to the dollar, but if it does, it won't happen suddenly. It'll be gradual, complex, driven by shifts in economic power, political influence, and global trust. Because at its core, the story of the dollar isn't really about money. It's about power. The power to shape global trade, the power to influence economics, the power to set the rules of the system itself. The dollar became the world's currency because of a unique combination of historical events, strategic decisions, and global confidence. It was built over decades, and like any system, it can change. The question isn't whether it will. The question is when, and what comes next.